Colorado Territory, 1875. Dry dust and desperate dreams. That was all Prescott's Landing had to offer most days. The wind swept through the valley like Judgment Day, scouring away any notion that this unforgiving land might treat softness with mercy. Yet Colton Ryder believed the frontier demanded nothing less than his complete solitude, a conviction as firmly rooted as the mountains framing the horizon. At 25, he had already buried enough hope beneath rocky soil to know that attachment was a luxury the West did not permit. The Rising Sun Ranch was his fortress against vulnerability. Its weathered fences and sturdy barns stood as monuments to his philosophy. A man needed nothing but his own 2 hands and enough determination to outwork the sun. His cattle prospered under his care, unlike the partnerships he'd seen crumble when gold fever or winter storms tested loyalties. The other ranchers respected him, even if they pitted the isolation he wrapped around himself like armor. Man wasn't meant to live alone, Colt, Sheriff Jenkins had remarked just last week, leaning against the hitching post outside the general store. Especially not a young buck like yourself. Colton had merely tightened the cinch on his saddle. The day I need company more than I need peace is the day they can put me in the ground, he'd replied, blue eyes hard as river stones. Seen too many good men lose everything chasing after a pretty face. But in the quiet evenings, when the lantern cast long shadows across his cabin walls, something hollow echoed in his chest, a space that cattle counts and fence mending couldn't fill. He told himself it was simply exhaustion, nothing that couldn't be remedied by dawn's purpose and labor's distraction. The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday, its wheels stirring dust devils that danced down Prescott's Landing's only street. Colton wouldn't have noticed at all if he hadn't been in town for supplies. He was loading sacks of grain into his wagon when the commotion drew his reluctant attention. The woman who stepped down from the coach didn't belong in a place like Prescott's Landing. Her pale blue traveling dress, though wrinkled from the journey, spoke of Eastern refinement. She couldn't have been more than 21, with honey blonde hair pinned beneath a modest hat. One gloved hand clutched a small suitcase, the other steadied herself against the coach door. Her gaze, wide and uncertain, swept across the dusty buildings and sun-weathered faces. Colton looked away, determined not to be caught staring like some green boy. Women came west with dreams that died faster than spring flowers in August heat. This one would be no different, either married off in desperation or headed back east within months. "You must be Miss Penelope Zayne," came Mrs. Henderson's booming voice from the boarding house steps. "We received your letter last week. Welcome to Prescott's Landing." Colton finished loading his supplies, the conversation drifting to him despite his disinterest. "Thank you, ma'am. Yes, I'm Penelope. I hope the teaching position is still available." Her voice carried a gentle cadence that somehow cut through the frontier harshness. "Of course, dear. Term starts in 2 weeks. Children here need learning almost as bad as they need manners." Colton snapped the reins and turned his wagon around, his mind already on the broken fence line in the north pasture. A schoolteacher was the town's business, not his. Teachers came and went like seasons. This one would blow away with the first hard winter. The abandoned Callaway place sat halfway between town and Colton's ranch, its weathered boards and overgrown garden a monument to broken dreams. James Callaway had brought his city bride out in '68, built her the finest home for 20 miles, then watched her and their infant son die of fever 3 years later. He'd ridden out one morning and never returned. Colton always quickened his horses past the place, a reminder of what happened when a man let hope take root too deeply. But today, the wagon was caught in a rut, forcing him to stop directly across from the sagging porch. As he worked to free it, movement caught his eye. Miss Zayne stood in the yard, that same small suitcase at her feet, staring up at the abandoned house with unmistakable interest. Mrs. Henderson hovered nearby, looking doubtful. "It needs work, I grant you," the teacher was saying, "but the structure seems sound. And you said it's been vacant for years. 4 years since poor James left. Nobody wants it, too many memories. But it's no place for a young woman alone, Miss Zayne." "I've been alone for some time now, Mrs. Henderson, and I'd prefer my own home to a boarding room, however kind your offer." The wheel came free with a jolt that nearly unseated Colton. Both women turned at the noise, and for the first time, he found himself locked in the gaze of Penelope Zayne. Her eyes were the clear blue of mountain lakes, direct and unafraid. "Good day, sir," she called, with the easy confidence of someone who expected civility even in the wilderness. He touched his hat brim, murmuring a response before urging his team forward. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the image of that small figure standing before the broken house, her chin lifted with determination that bordered on foolishness. Town gossip reached even Colton's isolated ranch. Within a week, everyone knew the new schoolteacher had purchased the Calloway place for a pittance and moved in with nothing but her suitcase and books. Mrs. Henderson sent her son with meals, and Doc Wilson rode out to check that the well was clean. Even Sheriff Jenkins made it his business to patrol past the property each evening. Girls got more sand than sense. Jasper from the Mercantile commented when Colton came for supplies the following week. Says she came from Philadelphia after her parents died. No family left. Guess she figured teaching savages in the territories was better than whatever waited back east. Not our concern, Colton replied, counting out coins for ammunition. Jasper's wife swatted his arm with a dust cloth. She's a sweet girl, and we should be grateful. Last teacher left after Billy Magruder put a snake in her desk. Determination don't fix a leaky roof, Jasper retorted. That place needs a man's touch. Colton rode home the long way, telling himself it was to check on strays. The lie became apparent when he found himself passing the Calloway place. He slowed his horse, observing the changes already visible. Someone had cleared the weeds from the front yard. The porch steps had been mended, and clean curtains hung in the windows. And there was Penelope herself, balanced precariously on a ladder against the side of the house, attempting to nail a loose board back into place. As he watched, the ladder shifted, and she clutched wildly at the wall. Before conscious thought could intervene, Colton had dismounted and covered the distance to her in long strides. "Ma'am, that's no job for." The ladder tilted further. With a small cry, Penelope tumbled backward, landing directly in Colton's outstretched arms. The hammer clattered to the ground beside them. For one suspended moment, her startled face was inches from his, close enough to see the faint freckles across her nose and the way her eyes widened in surprise rather than fear. She smelled of lavender soap and honest sweat. "Oh," she gasped, quickly regaining her composure. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder." Colton Ryder. He set her on her feet and stepped back, suddenly aware of how inappropriate their position might appear. "That ladder's not safe." "So I discovered." She straightened her skirt, a flush rising in her cheeks. "Mr. Ryder, you're the rancher from the North Valley, correct? Mrs. Henderson mentioned you." "Rising Sun Ranch, yes ma'am." He picked up the fallen hammer, frowning at the broken rungs of the ladder. "This repair work isn't suitable for a woman alone?" Her chin lifted slightly. "Perhaps not, but necessity makes poor distinctions about suitability." The board was letting in rain. Colton studied the house's weathered siding. At least a dozen boards needed replacing, not to mention the sagging roof. "You've taken on quite a project, Miss Zayne." "Life is a project, Mr. Ryder." Her smile transformed her face, revealing dimples he hadn't noticed before. Some worth undertaking despite the challenges. The simplicity of her statement caught him off guard. "I could secure that board for you," he found himself offering. "Since I'm here." Her surprised gratitude made something shift uncomfortably in his chest. He repaired the loose siding, then found himself examining the roof, the well pump, the sagging porch. Before he realized it, the afternoon had slipped away, and she was inviting him to stay for coffee. "I can't offer much," she apologized, leading him inside. "But the stove works beautifully now that Mr. Wilson showed me how to properly set the flue." The interior of the cabin was sparse but meticulously clean. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that must have consumed most of the space in her small suitcase. A desk near the window held neatly stacked papers, lesson plans, he assumed. "Teaching suits you?" he asked, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "It's what I know." Her smile held something he couldn't quite name. "My father was a professor before his investments failed. Teaching was the only skill I had to offer when he and mother passed last winter." The simple, unembellished truth of her statement struck Colton more forcefully than any elaborate tale of woe might have. She stated her circumstances as plain fact, neither seeking pity nor displaying shame. "The children here aren't exactly schooled in etiquette," he warned. Billy Magruder once put a garter snake in the previous teacher's drawer. Then Billy and I will have to reach an understanding about appropriate classroom conduct. Her eyes sparkled with humor. I suspect he'll find I'm not easily frightened away. As the sun began to set, Colton knew he should leave. Instead, he found himself inspecting her stovepipe, explaining how to bank coals to last through cold nights, and promising to bring proper tools for the roof on his next trip to town. Riding home in the gathering dusk, he tried to dismiss the encounter as simple neighborly duty. Anyone would have helped a woman alone with repairs. But his thoughts kept returning to the quiet dignity in her eyes, and the way she'd built a semblance of home with nothing but determination and a suitcase of books. Fool woman needs to find herself a husband, he muttered to his horse. Won't last a winter alone. The horse, unimpressed with this assessment, continued plodding homeward without comment. When the school term began, Colton told himself he had no reason to ride into town more frequently. Yet somehow his errands multiplied, each one coincidentally timed to the end of the school day. He'd tip his hat to Miss Zayne as she walked her students to the junction where town paths diverged, pretending his presence was mere happenstance. October brought early frost and reports of cattle raiders working the territory. Sheriff Jenkins warned ranchers to be vigilant, especially those with remote holdings like the Rising Sun. Colton set his ranch hands to night watches and moved his prized bulls closer to the main compound. On a blustery Tuesday, he rode into town for ammunition and updates on the raiders' movements. School had let out early for a funeral, and he found himself hesitating outside the small schoolhouse. Through the window, he could see Penelope at her desk, head bent over papers, lamplight gilding her hair. The simple domesticity of the scene struck him with unexpected force. He tied his horse and entered without giving himself time to reconsider. She looked up, surprise melting into a smile that transformed her face. Mr. Ryder, what brings you to my academic domain? Town business, he said, suddenly self-conscious about the mud on his boots. Heard about the raiders? Sheriff Jenkins mentioned something. Should I be concerned? Just be cautious. Keep your doors locked at night. He glanced around the schoolroom, noting the careful organization, the children's drawings pinned to the walls. How are you finding our local scholars? Bright, curious, and desperately in need of structure. Her eyes sparkled. Even Billy Magruder, who did indeed attempt the snake incident you predicted. We've since reached an understanding. Is that so? Colton couldn't help but smile. He now helps me collect specimens for natural science lessons. His knowledge of local wildlife is quite impressive. The conversation flowed with unexpected ease. Before he realized it, he was walking her home, their horses side by side as she described her plans for a school garden come spring. The children need to understand where food comes from, she explained. Some have never seen vegetables that didn't come from Mrs. Henderson's garden. You're planning to stay through spring then? The question came out more pointed than he'd intended. She gave him a measured look. I signed a year's contract, Mr. Ryder. I honor my commitments. And after? After depends on many things. She studied the horizon, something wistful in her expression. I came west with dreams of building something meaningful. A year seems hardly enough time for that. At her gate, she turned to him with unexpected directness. The harvest social is Saturday next. Will you attend? The question caught him off guard. I don't usually. You should. Community is important, especially with winter coming. Her gaze held his, challenging yet warm. Even the most self-sufficient among us occasionally needs neighbors, Mr. Ryder. He found himself nodding. Those socials were precisely the kind of gathering he avoided. Perhaps. Her smile suggested she recognized the concession for what it was, a small breach in his carefully constructed solitude. The night of the harvest social, Colton spent an unprecedented amount of time on his appearance. He shaved meticulously, donned his seldom-worn dress shirt, and even polished his boots. The ranch hands exchanged knowing glances, but wisely kept their comments to themselves. The town hall blazed with lantern light, fiddle music spilling into the cool evening air. Colton hesitated at the entrance, already regretting his decision. Then he caught sight of Penelope across the room, a green dress brightening her complexion as she laughed with Mrs. Henderson. Something lightened in his chest at the sound of that laugh. Well, look what the wind blew in. Sheriff Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. Didn't expect to see you, Ryder. Just checking on those raider reports, Colton muttered. At a dance. Jenkins grinned. Wouldn't have anything to do with our pretty schoolteacher, would it? Before Colton could form a suitably dismissive response, Penelope herself approached, her eyes bright with welcome. Mr. Ryder, you came. Her genuine pleasure at his presence disarmed him completely. Miss Zayne. He managed a slight bow. The social seems well attended. Indeed. Mrs. Henderson outdid herself with the apple preserves. She glanced toward the dance floor where couples were lining up for a reel. Do you dance, Mr. Ryder? Not in years. Then perhaps it's time to remember how. She held out her hand with simple directness. I find skills return more quickly than we expect. To his own astonishment, Colton found himself taking her hand and allowing her to lead him to the floor. The touch of her gloved fingers against his palm sent an unexpected warmth up his arm. The dance was lively enough that conversation was impossible, a blessing given how thoroughly her proximity had scattered his thoughts. When the music finally ended, he was breathing hard from more than exertion. See? Not forgotten at all, she said, her cheeks flushed prettily. You dance very well, Mr. Ryder. Colton, he found himself saying. If we're to be dance partners, perhaps Mr. Ryder is unnecessarily formal. Her smile deepened. Then you must call me Penelope, of course. The evening passed in a blur of dancing, punch-cup conversations, and the strange, persistent warmth in his chest whenever she smiled. For the first time in years, the weight of solitude lifted from Colton's shoulders. When he escorted her home under a canopy of stars, the silence between them felt companionable rather than empty. Thank you for coming tonight, she said at her gate. I suspect it wasn't easy for you. Easier than I expected, he admitted. The fearsome things we anticipate often prove less daunting than our imaginations suggest. She rested her hand briefly on his arm. Good night, Colton. He rode home with her touch still warm through his sleeve, unsettled by how quickly she had breached the carefully constructed fortress of his isolation. Caring was dangerous on the frontier. Caring made a man vulnerable to loss, and loss was the one constant in this unforgiving land. Yet when the first heavy snowfall came a week later, Colton found himself riding toward the Calloway place with a load of split firewood. He told himself it was simple practicality. The teacher freezing to death would leave the town's children uneducated. But the flutter in his stomach when she opened the door, wrapped in a shawl with snowflakes in her hair, suggested a different truth. Winter deepened, and with it, the undeniable connection growing between them. His visits became regular, Sunday afternoons spent repairing loose boards, teaching her to properly bank a fire, sharing coffee at her small table. She told him of Philadelphia, of her father's academic dreams, and her mother's genteel poverty after his death. He found himself sharing pieces of his own history, the ranch inherited from an uncle, the sister lost to fever, the partner who'd abandoned their cattle venture when gold was discovered in the next territory. So that's why you keep to yourself, she said one snowy afternoon, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. You believe attachment leads only to loss. The simple accuracy of her assessment unsettled him. Out here, it usually does. And yet people still build homes, form communities, create families. Her gaze was direct, challenging. If loss were truly inevitable, wouldn't everyone choose solitude? Most folks haven't learned the hard way. Or perhaps they've learned a different lesson entirely. She set down her mug. That connection, even temporary, holds more value than perfect safety in isolation. Her words followed him home through the gathering dusk, challenging the foundation upon which he'd built his entire existence. The ranch house, once a sanctuary of self-sufficiency, suddenly seemed hollow with its empty chairs and silent rooms. The next day, a blizzard swept across the valley, blanketing the world in blinding white. Colton paced his cabin, watching through frosted windows as the snow piled higher. All he could think about was Penelope in her inadequately insulated house, with her city-bred understanding of winter. Had she stocked enough wood? Did she know to check the flue regularly when the snow was this heavy? By mid-afternoon, his worry overrode caution. He saddled his most sure-footed horse, packed emergency supplies, and set out into the storm. The journey that normally took 30 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours of grueling progress through drifts and wind that cut like knives. When he finally spotted the chimney smoke from her cabin, relief nearly buckled his knees. But as he drew closer, he noticed the front door standing partially open, snow blowing into the entrance. "Penelope," he called, dismounting and trudging through thigh-high drifts. Penelope. The interior was frigid, snow coating the entryway floor. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved deeper into the cabin. Colton. Her voice came from the back room, weak but alive. He found her on the floor beside her bed, one leg awkwardly extended. What happened? He knelt beside her, hands moving instinctively to check for injuries. The roof was creaking so badly. I tried to clear some snow away. She winced as his fingers probed her ankle. The ladder shifted. It seems we've established a pattern. Even in pain, she managed a smile that twisted something in his chest. You shouldn't have been on a ladder in a blizzard. So I've concluded. Rather painfully. She tried to move and gasped. I managed to crawl back inside, but I can't stand. The ankle was swelling rapidly. Not broken, he thought, but badly sprained. He lifted her carefully onto the bed, trying to ignore how right she felt in his arms, how perfectly she fit against his chest. We need to get you warm. He moved with efficient purpose, building up the fire, closing the door against the howling wind, heating water for tea. All the while, his mind circled one inescapable truth. She could have died, alone and injured, while he sat safely at his ranch. The thought was unbearable. You can't stay here tonight, he said, bringing her a cup of willow bark tea for the pain. The storm's getting worse. I need to get you somewhere warmer. I hardly think traveling through a blizzard is advisable. She sipped the bitter tea without complaint. My place is better insulated, with proper supplies. He met her gaze directly. I know what people will say, but your safety matters more than gossip. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, but we should leave a note, in case someone checks on me when the storm breaks. He wrapped her in every blanket she owned, then carried her to his horse. The journey back was even more treacherous, with Penelope seated before him in the saddle, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. Her head eventually came to rest against his shoulder, her body trembling with cold despite the blankets. Almost there, he murmured against her hair. Stay with me, Penelope. By the time they reached the ranch, darkness had fallen completely. He carried her inside, settling her near the roaring fireplace while he prepared hot broth and more willow bark tea. Your home is beautiful, she said, looking around at the solid log walls and well-crafted furniture. You built this yourself? Most of it. He handed her the steaming mug. The main structure was here, but I expanded it over the years. Always thought someday. He trailed off, unwilling to admit he'd built with a family in mind, before experience taught him better. It's meant for more than one person, she observed quietly. Plans change. He busied himself tending the fire. You should rest. You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here. Colton. Her voice stopped him. Thank you. Not just for today, but for everything these past months. You've made a stranger feel less alone in a strange land. The simple gratitude in her eyes undid him completely. Before he could reconsider, he crossed to her side and knelt beside her chair. You're not a stranger anymore, Penelope. His voice came out rougher than intended. And I was the one alone, until you arrived. The blizzard raged for 3 days. 3 days of domestic intimacy that rewrote everything Colton thought he understood about himself. 3 days of quiet conversations beside the fire, of teaching Penelope to play checkers, of sharing stories from childhood. 3 days of watching her move through his home in a borrowed shirt and blanket-wrapped skirt, her hair loose down her back, belonging there as if she'd always been part of the space. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the storm finally began to subside, they sat before the fire playing their 15th game of checkers. Her ankle, propped on a pillow, had begun to heal. King me, she said triumphantly, moving her piece to his back row. He placed a second checker atop hers. You're getting entirely too good at this. I may have to teach you poker instead. My father would be scandalized. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. Which means we absolutely must. The easy domesticity between them suddenly overwhelmed him. How naturally they'd fallen into patterns of shared space and gentle teasing. How essential she had become to his happiness in so short a time. Penny, he said, using the nickname that had emerged somewhere during their confinement. When the road's clear, I should take you back to town. Her smile faded slightly. Of course, people will talk enough as it is. That's not. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated at his inability to express the tangle of emotions in his chest. I don't care what they say. But you deserve better than being trapped here with me. Trapped? She set down her checker, eyes searching his face. Is that how you see these days? No. God, no. The words burst from him. These have been the best days I can remember. That's what scares me. Why should happiness frighten you? Because it ends. The admission felt torn from somewhere deep inside him. Everyone I've ever. He couldn't finish the sentence. Loved? She supplied gently. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Colton. She reached across the checkerboard to touch his hand. Loss is the price we pay for loving. But isolation is paying that price without ever receiving the gift. Her words cracked something open inside him. Without conscious thought, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. She responded immediately, her hand coming up to cup his cheek, her mouth soft and yielding beneath his. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were shining with emotions that mirrored the storm in his own heart. I've been hoping you would do that, she whispered. I shouldn't have. But his hand remained entwined with hers. You deserve someone whole, not a man who spent years hiding from connection. Perhaps I see you more clearly than you see yourself. Her thumb traced patterns on his palm. A man who builds a house with room for others hasn't truly given up on love, only buried it beneath fear. The roads cleared enough by week's end for Colton to take Penelope back to town. The gossip began immediately, of course, whispers about the schoolteacher who'd spent days alone with the reclusive rancher. But something had fundamentally shifted between them, a bridge across isolation that neither could pretend didn't exist. He began courting her properly, Sunday dinners at the boarding house under Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye, escorting her to church socials, bringing small gifts that spoke of attention rather than extravagance, a jar of honey from his bees, a book of poetry he'd ridden all the way to the county seat to find, a carved wooden box for her desk. Spring brought new challenges. The cattle raiders Sheriff Jenkins had warned about grew bolder, striking ranches closer to town. When the Abernathy place was hit, with 2 ranch hands wounded in the raid, tension spread through the valley like wildfire. You should stay in town until they're caught, Colton told Penelope after church one Sunday. The Calloway place is too isolated. I can't abandon my home every time there's danger, she replied, the stubborn lift of her chin now familiar to him. Besides, the children need consistency in their education. Their argument ended unresolved, with Colton riding out to his ranch with worry gnawing at his gut. That night, he doubled the watch around his cattle and cleaned his rifle by lamplight, unable to shake the foreboding that had settled over him. 3 days later, returning from the north pasture at dusk, he spotted smoke on the horizon. Too much smoke, in the direction of Penelope's cabin. Terror drove him harder than he'd ever pushed a horse before. As he crested the final rise, the scene below confirmed his worst fears. The Calloway place engulfed in flames, 3 riders circling the burning structure like predators around wounded prey. And there was Penelope, backed against the well housing, clutching what appeared to be a small derringer as the men closed in. Colton didn't remember dismounting or drawing his rifle. All he knew was the cold clarity of purpose as he sighted down the barrel and fired. One raider fell from his horse. The others wheeled, searching for the source of the shot. Ride off or die where you stand. Colton's voice carried across the clearing, each word punctuated by the metallic sound of his rifle being reloaded. The remaining raiders exchanged glances, then spurred their horses away from the burning cabin, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Only when they were out of sight did Colton race down the slope toward Penelope. She flew into his arms the moment he reached her, the small pistol falling forgotten to the ground. Colton, thank God. He crushed her against his chest, his heart pounding with adrenaline and relief. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? No, I'm unharmed. They wanted information about the larger ranches, layouts, guard schedules. Her voice trembled. When I couldn't tell them what they wanted, they set the fire to loosen my tongue. Rage surged through him at the thought of her facing such terror alone. I should have been here. I should have. You came when it mattered most. She pulled back to look at him, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes clear and determined. You saved my life. The burning cabin illuminated her face in flickering orange light, revealing a strength that humbled him. This woman had faced raiders with nothing but a derringer and her wits, had built a life from nothing but determination and dreams. And still, somehow, she looked at him as if he were the brave one. Marry me, he said, the words escaping before conscious thought could intervene. Her eyes widened. What? Marry me, Penelope. Now that the words were spoken, certainty flooded through him. I love you. I think I've loved you since you stood in front of that broken house with nothing but a suitcase and determination. I was afraid of losing you, but tonight showed me the only thing worse than loss is never having claimed what matters most. Tears filled her eyes, catching the firelight. Are you certain? You once told me the frontier is no place for love. I was wrong. He cupped her face gently. The frontier is precisely where love matters most. Where else do we need someone to stand beside us against all that would destroy us? Her answer came not in words, but in the press of her lips against his, fierce and certain despite the chaos around them. When they finally broke apart, her smile held all the promise of tomorrow. Yes, she whispered against his mouth. Yes, I will marry you, Colton Ryder. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Prescott's Landing, after the sheriff had captured the remaining raiders, and while the community was still helping Penelope salvage what could be saved from the cabin ruins. Mrs. Henderson provided a simple white dress. Jasper from the mercantile stood as witness. Colton presented Penelope with his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small, perfect diamond that had traveled west in his father's pocket decades earlier. I can't give you Philadelphia drawing rooms, he told her the night before their wedding, as they sat on the porch of what would now be their home. But I promise you'll never face another storm alone. I didn't come west seeking drawing rooms, she replied, her head resting against his shoulder. I came seeking purpose, and found far more than I dreamed possible. The wedding breakfast stretched long into the afternoon, with the entire town gathering to celebrate. Billy Magruder presented the couple with a carefully preserved butterfly specimen for scientific study, while Mrs. Henderson wept openly into her handkerchief and declared it the most romantic thing Prescott's Landing had ever witnessed. The schoolteacher who arrived with nothing but a suitcase, marrying the most confirmed bachelor in the territory, she sniffled. It's like something from a novel. As sunset painted the valley in gold, Colton helped his bride into their wagon for the journey home. The rising sun ranch waited on the horizon, its windows gleaming with welcome light. Are you ready, Mrs. Ryder? He asked, taking up the reins. Penelope's hand found his, her new ring catching the fading sunlight. I've been ready since the moment I stepped off that stagecoach. As they drove toward home, their home, Colton reflected on how thoroughly one determined woman had transformed his understanding of the frontier. It wasn't a place where connection meant inevitable loss. It was a place where love was the only shelter that truly mattered against life's storms. The empty chairs at his table would be empty no longer. The silence of his evenings would be filled with conversation and laughter. The future stretched before them not as a lonely vigil against hardship, but as a shared adventure. Penelope Zayne had arrived in Prescott's Landing with nothing but a suitcase and dreams. Colton Ryder had given her a ring and his last name. But she had given him something far more precious, the courage to believe that even on the unforgiving frontier, a heart open to love was not a weakness but the greatest strength of all.